The morning sun cast long shadows across the royal gardens as Margaret stepped onto the balcony of Ashford Palace. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the stone railing, watching the groundskeepers tend to the roses below. These same gardens had witnessed decades of her family's history, from joyful celebrations to moments of profound sorrow. Today felt different, though. There was a heaviness in the air that she couldn't shake. Inside the palace, her husband James was meeting with the royal physicians for what seemed like the 100th time this month. The conversations had grown shorter and more somber with each visit. Margaret knew what they were discussing without being told. The cancer that had been quietly ravaging James's body for the past 2 years was winning its battle. Despite the best medical care money could provide, Margaret closed her eyes and remembered their wedding day 35 years ago. James had been so young and full of life then, his smile lighting up the cathedral as she walked down the aisle. The crowds outside had cheered for hours, throwing flower petals and waving flags. They had believed in fairy tales then, in happily ever after. Neither of them had imagined that their love story would one day face such a cruel ending. The sound of footsteps behind her made Margaret turn. James emerged from the palace, moving more slowly than he had just weeks before. His once broad shoulders were now thin beneath his sweater, and the color had drained from his cheeks. But his eyes still held that same kindness that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago. "The doctors want to increase my medication again," James said softly, joining her at the railing. His voice was weaker now, barely above a whisper. Margaret reached for his hand, noting how cold his fingers felt against hers. "Whatever they think is best," she replied, though they both knew the medications were only buying time now. The treatments had stopped being about curing months ago, and had shifted to simply making James as comfortable as possible for whatever time remained. James squeezed her hand gently. "I want to talk to the children today. All of them. Together." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. They had been avoiding this conversation with their 3 children, hoping for more time, hoping for a miracle that seemed less likely with each passing day. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Margaret asked, searching his face. She saw the determination there, mixed with a sadness that broke her heart all over again. "I've been thinking about it all night," James admitted. "They deserve to know what's happening. They deserve to say goodbye properly." The word goodbye hung in the air between them like a physical weight. Margaret nodded, tears threatening to spill over. She had known this day would come. But knowing and being ready were 2 entirely different things. Their eldest son, Michael, was already struggling with the burden of knowing he would one day inherit not just his father's title, but also the responsibility of leading their family through this transition. Their daughter, Sarah, had been trying to maintain her normal routine, but Margaret could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked at her father. And their youngest, David, was still trying to process why his strong, invincible father was suddenly so fragile. The couple stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the world continue its normal rhythm below them. Gardeners pruned hedges, staff members hurried across the courtyard with purpose, and in the distance they could see the first tour groups of the day gathering at the palace gates. Life was continuing around them, even as their own world felt like it was slowly coming to an end. "I love you," James said suddenly, turning to face Margaret fully. "I need you to know that whatever happens, these have been the best years of my life. You've made every single day worth living." Margaret felt the tears she'd been holding back finally begin to fall. "I love you too," she whispered back. "More than I ever thought possible." As they held each other on the balcony, neither of them noticed the photographer with the long-range lens positioned discreetly among the trees beyond the palace walls. The image he captured that morning would later become one of the most heartbreaking and iconic photographs in royal history, showing 2 people saying goodbye to the life they had built together, unaware that the world was already beginning to watch their private pain unfold. The family gathering that afternoon was unlike any other in the history of Ashford Palace. Margaret had arranged for tea to be served in the blue drawing room, the same room where she and James had announced their engagement decades earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were now using this space for such a different kind of announcement. Michael arrived first, his face already showing the strain of the responsibilities he knew were coming. At 32, he had been preparing for leadership his entire life, but no amount of training could have prepared him for losing his father so young. He embraced James carefully, as if his father might break at any moment. Sarah came in shortly after, her usual bright energy notably subdued. She had been working as a children's advocate for several years, traveling around the world to support various charitable causes. But she had quietly canceled all her upcoming trips to spend more time at home, though she hadn't told her parents why. The worry in her eyes was impossible to hide. David, the youngest at 26, bounded into the room with his characteristic enthusiasm, but stopped short when he saw the serious expressions on everyone's faces. He had always been the light-hearted one in the family, the one who could make his father laugh even on the most difficult days. But lately, even his jokes couldn't seem to break through the growing sadness that surrounded them all. James waited until everyone was seated before speaking. The words came slowly, each one carefully chosen. He explained about the progression of his illness, about the doctor's latest assessments, and about the difficult decisions that lay ahead. Margaret watched their children's faces as understanding dawned, seeing her own heartbreak reflected in their eyes. "How long?" Michael asked quietly, his voice barely steady. It was the question they had all been afraid to ask. "The doctors think maybe 6 months," James replied. "Maybe less." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah was the first to cry, covering her face with her hands as sobs shook her shoulders. David moved to comfort her, but Margaret could see that he was fighting back his own tears. Michael sat perfectly still, his training in royal composure warring with his grief as a son. "I want you to know that I'm not afraid," James continued. "I've had an incredible life, and I've been blessed with the most amazing family anyone could ask for. But I am worried about all of you. I need to know that you'll take care of each other when I'm gone." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult any of them had ever experienced. They talked about practical matters, about the transition of duties, about how to handle the public announcement when the time came. But mostly, they simply held each other and grieved together for the future they wouldn't have. Outside the palace walls, rumors were already beginning to circulate. James had been noticeably absent from several public engagements recently, and palace officials had been giving increasingly vague explanations for his absences. The photograph from that morning, though not yet published, was already making its way through certain media circles. The royal family's privacy was about to become much more complicated. That evening, as the children prepared to leave, each of them spent private time with their father. Michael discussed the responsibilities he would inherit, trying to memorize every piece of advice James offered. Sarah showed him pictures from her recent charity work, wanting to share every detail of the causes that had become so important to her. David simply sat with his father, holding his hand and talking about ordinary things, as if normalcy could somehow push away the reality of what was happening. Margaret stood in the doorway watching these goodbye conversations, knowing that each one might be among the last of its kind. The man she had loved for more than half her life was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Later that night, as James slept fitfully beside her, Margaret made a decision. Tomorrow she would call the palace's communications director. It was time to start preparing for the public announcement that would change everything. The world would soon know that they were losing their beloved king, and she wanted to control that narrative as much as possible. James deserved dignity in his final months, and she was determined to protect that at all costs. The last thing Margaret remembered before falling asleep was the sound of James's labored breathing beside her, and her silent prayer that they would have just a little more time together before the world intruded on their private grief. 3 weeks later, the palace could no longer maintain its silence. James had collapsed during a private dinner, and though he recovered quickly, the incident made it clear that his condition was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. Margaret sat in the communications office with the palace's senior staff, drafting the statement that would change everything. "We need to be honest but hopeful," Margaret said, reviewing the third draft of the announcement. "The people love him. They deserve to know the truth, but they also need to maintain some hope." Her voice was steady, but everyone in the room could see the toll this was taking on her. The statement was released at exactly noon on a Tuesday. Within minutes, news outlets around the world were running breaking news alerts. King James battling serious illness flashed across television screens from London to New York to Tokyo. The palace switchboard was immediately overwhelmed with calls from journalists, well-wishers, and world leaders. James insisted on watching the news coverage from his private study, despite Margaret's protests that it might be too overwhelming. They sat together on the sofa, his head resting on her shoulder, as reporter after reporter discussed his condition with a mixture of respect and speculation that made Margaret's stomach turn. "Look at that," James said softly, pointing to the television screen. The camera was showing the gates of Ashford Palace where hundreds of people had already gathered. They were leaving flowers, cards, and small gifts. Children held handmade signs with messages of love and support. An elderly woman was crying as she placed a bouquet of roses by the palace fence. "They really do care," Margaret whispered, surprised by the immediate outpouring of affection. She had known intellectually that James was beloved by his people, but seeing this spontaneous demonstration of love was deeply moving. The next few days brought an unprecedented response from around the world. Letters and cards arrived by the thousands. World leaders called to express their support. Social media was flooded with memories and messages of gratitude for James's years of service. The hashtag #PrayForKing James was trending globally, but perhaps most touching were the personal stories that began to emerge. A teacher in Scotland wrote about how James's visit to her classroom 10 years earlier had inspired her students to pursue their dreams. A veteran shared how James had personally attended his daughter's funeral after she was killed in military service. Families across the kingdom shared memories of encounters with James at various events, all describing his genuine kindness and interest in their lives. James was deeply moved by these stories, but the constant attention was also exhausting. His energy levels were declining noticeably, and simple activities that had been routine just weeks earlier now left him breathless and weak. Margaret found herself becoming fiercely protective of his time and energy, carefully screening visitors and limiting his exposure to the overwhelming public response. Michael had quietly begun taking on more of his father's official duties, though the palace was careful not to make this transition too obvious to the public. Sarah had moved back into the palace temporarily, wanting to spend as much time as possible with her father. David was struggling the most with the public attention, unused to the intense scrutiny that now followed the family's every move. One evening, as Margaret was helping James get ready for bed, he suddenly grabbed her hand tightly. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible. It was the first time he had expressed fear since his diagnosis, and it broke Margaret's heart all over again. "I know," she whispered back, climbing into bed beside him and holding him close. "I'm scared too." They lay in the darkness together, neither of them sleeping, both of them acutely aware that nights like this were numbered. The next morning brought news that would change everything again. A major international crisis was developing, and the government was requesting James's input on the response. Despite his condition, James insisted on participating in the emergency meetings. Margaret watched from the doorway as her husband, despite his obvious weakness, provided the kind of thoughtful leadership that had defined his reign. It was after this meeting that Margaret realized something that both terrified and inspired her. James wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting to fulfill his duties as king for as long as possible, even if it meant sacrificing what little energy he had left. His sense of responsibility to his people was going to drive him to work until his very last breath. That night, Margaret made another difficult decision. She called each of their children and asked them to come home permanently. If James was determined to spend his remaining time serving his people, she wanted to make sure his family was close enough to grab whatever precious moments they could find in between his royal obligations. The end was coming faster than any of them had expected, and Margaret was determined not to waste a single day they had left together. The autumn months passed in a blur of private moments and public appearances carefully choreographed around James's declining health. Margaret had become expert at reading the subtle signs of his exhaustion, knowing exactly when to step in and guide him away from crowds or cameras. The palace staff had developed an intricate system of signals and backup plans to accommodate his unpredictable energy levels. James's final public appearance came in November, at the annual Remembrance Day ceremony. Margaret stood beside him as he placed a wreath at the memorial, her heart breaking as she watched him struggle to maintain his composure through the brief ceremony. The photographs from that day would later be recognized as some of the most poignant in royal history, showing a king literally giving everything he had left to honor his commitments to his people. In the car ride back to the palace, James collapsed completely for the first time. Margaret held him as palace security rushed them to the private medical wing, where the royal physicians confirmed what everyone already knew. James would not be making any more public appearances. His battle was entering its final stage. The next few weeks were a strange mixture of profound sadness and unexpected grace. With the pressure of public duties finally lifted, James seemed to find a new kind of peace. He spent long afternoons in the garden with Margaret, wrapped in blankets and watching the seasons change. They talked about their early years together, about their children's accomplishments, about the changes they had witnessed in their country and the world. Michael had officially begun serving as regent, handling the day-to-day responsibilities of the crown, while James focused on his health and family. The transition was seamless in terms of official duties, but emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Michael carried the weight of knowing he was essentially stepping into his father's shoes, while his father was still alive to see it happen. Sarah had taken over many of Margaret's charitable responsibilities, throwing herself into the work with an intensity that worried her mother. Margaret recognized the behavior as Sarah's way of coping with grief, but she also knew that her daughter was processing the loss in her own way. David had become the family's unofficial guardian of normalcy, organizing movie nights and family dinners, desperately trying to create moments of joy in the midst of their sorrow. The media coverage had evolved too. The initial frenzy of speculation had given way to more respectful reporting, with most outlets choosing to focus on James's legacy rather than the daily details of his condition. Several documentary crews were already working on retrospectives of his reign, and historians were beginning to assess his place in the long line of monarchs. But inside the palace walls, the focus remained intensely personal. Margaret had moved a bed into James's room so she could be near him at all times. The medical equipment that now surrounded him was a constant reminder of how much had changed, but she refused to let it define these final weeks together. One December evening, as snow began to fall outside the palace windows, James asked Margaret to read to him from their old photo albums. They spent hours looking through pictures from their wedding, their children's births, state visits, and family vacations. Each image sparked memories and stories, some funny, some touching, all precious. "Do you remember our first Christmas as a married couple?" James asked, pointing to a picture of them laughing beside an enormous Christmas tree. "You burned the turkey and we ended up eating sandwiches in the breakfast room." Margaret laughed despite her tears. "You said it was the best Christmas dinner you'd ever had." She could still remember how young and optimistic they had been, how convinced they were that love could conquer anything. "I meant it then, and I mean it now," James said softly. "Every Christmas with you has been perfect, even this one." He gestured around the room with its medical equipment and monitoring devices. "Especially this one, because I know it's the last one I'll get to spend watching you try not to cry every time you look at me." Margaret couldn't help but smile through her tears. Even now, even in these circumstances, James could still make her laugh. It was one of the things she loved most about him, and one of the things she would miss most desperately. That night, as James slept fitfully beside her, Margaret began writing letters. Letters to each of their children to be opened after James was gone. Letters to her grandchildren who were still too young to understand what was happening. Letters to herself, trying to capture every detail of these final days so that someday, when the grief wasn't so overwhelming, she could remember not just the sadness but also the love that filled these moments. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the palace grounds in pristine white. It felt like the world was preparing for something, holding its breath for the moment when everything would change forever. The call came at 3 a.m. on a quiet January night. Margaret had been dozing in the chair beside James's bed when his breathing suddenly changed. The medical team arrived within minutes, but they all knew this was the moment they had been preparing for. James was conscious but struggling, his eyes finding Margaret's face in the dim light of the room. Michael, Sarah, and David rushed to the palace from their nearby residences, still in their pajamas and coats thrown hastily over their clothes. The scene that greeted them was both heartbreaking and beautiful. James was surrounded by the people he loved most, holding Margaret's hand tightly as the monitors around him showed the reality none of them wanted to accept. "I need you all to know," James whispered, his voice barely audible, that you've made my life extraordinary. Margaret, you've been my everything for 35 years. Michael, you're going to be an amazing king. Sarah, keep fighting for the people who need you most. David, never lose that beautiful heart of yours. Each of his children took turns saying goodbye, sharing final words that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Michael promised to lead with the same integrity his father had shown. Sarah vowed to continue the charitable work that had defined so much of James's reign. David simply held his father's hand and told him how much he loved him, his voice breaking with emotion. As dawn began to break over the palace grounds, James looked at Margaret one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything, for the life we built together, for loving me through all of this." Margaret kissed his forehead gently, whispering words of love that only he could hear. James passed peacefully at 6:47 a.m., surrounded by his family and bathed in the soft light of the winter sunrise. The monitors fell silent, and for a moment, the room was filled with a profound stillness that seemed to acknowledge the magnitude of what had just occurred. The king was gone, but in his final moments, he had simply been a beloved husband and father saying goodbye to the people who mattered most. Margaret remained by his side for several minutes after he was gone, memorizing his peaceful expression and saying her own private goodbye to the man who had been her partner in everything. When she finally stood up, she found her children waiting for her with open arms, and they grieved together as a family before the world would intrude on their loss. The palace machinery that had been prepared for this moment began to move with quiet efficiency. The Prime Minister was notified, as were the leaders of other Commonwealth nations and governments around the world. The palace communications team prepared the official announcement that would be released within the hour. Security was increased around all royal residences as preparations began for the massive logistical undertaking that would be James's funeral. But in the hours immediately following his death, before the official announcements and media frenzy began, the family was allowed to grieve privately. They shared stories about James, laughed through their tears at funny memories, and began the impossible process of imagining life without him. Margaret found herself thinking about their conversation months earlier, when James had worried about how she and the children would cope after he was gone. Looking at Michael as he quietly took charge of the necessary arrangements, watching Sarah comfort her younger brother, seeing David's determination to support his mother, Margaret realized that James's greatest legacy wasn't his reign or his public service. It was the family he had raised and the love he had taught them to share with each other. The official announcement was released at 8 a.m. sharp. His Majesty King James passed away peacefully this morning at Ashford Palace, surrounded by his family. The Queen and the royal family are grateful for the support and love shown during His Majesty's illness, and ask for privacy during this time of mourning. Within minutes, the news was spreading around the world. Flags were lowered to half-staff, television networks interrupted regular programming, and people began gathering outside the palace gates to leave flowers and pay their respects. The global outpouring of grief was immediate and overwhelming, but inside the palace, Margaret barely noticed. She was focused entirely on the enormous task of saying goodbye to the love of her life while somehow finding the strength to help her children through their own grief. The next few days would bring the complexity of a state funeral, the transition of power, and the intense scrutiny of a world watching their family mourn in public. But in those first quiet hours after James's death, they were simply a family holding each other through the most difficult moment of their lives, finding comfort in their shared love for a man who had touched countless lives but belonged most completely to them. The 10 days between James's death and his funeral became a period of national mourning unlike anything the country had experienced in generations. Margaret watched from the palace windows as thousands of people queued for hours to pay their respects to James as he lay in state. The line stretched for miles through the capital city, with people of all ages and backgrounds waiting patiently for their chance to say goodbye to their king. What struck Margaret most was the diversity of the mourners. There were elderly couples who remembered James's coronation decades earlier, young families who had grown up knowing no other monarch, veterans still wearing their military medals, and children clutching handmade cards and drawings. The love for James transcended every boundary of age, class, and background, creating a unity in grief that Margaret found both heartbreaking and deeply comforting. The funeral preparations consumed the palace staff completely. Every detail had to be perfect, From the order of service to the seating arrangements for hundreds of world leaders, from the music selections to the security protocols, Margaret insisted on being involved in every decision, finding comfort in the familiar ritual of royal protocol even as her heart was breaking. 3 days before the funeral, Margaret received a letter that changed everything. It was from a young girl named Emma, whose family had been helped by one of James's charities after her father lost his job. Emma wrote about how King James had personally visited their family during a particularly difficult time, bringing groceries and staying to play board games with her and her siblings. The letter ended with a simple drawing of James wearing his crown, but smiling like a regular grandfather. Margaret shared the letter with her children that evening, and they all wept together over this reminder of who James had been beyond his royal titles. He had been a man who genuinely cared about individual people, who remembered names and faces, who used his position to make real differences in real lives. This was the legacy that mattered most to all of them. The night before the funeral, Margaret couldn't sleep. She walked through the palace rooms that held so many memories of her life with James, the study where he had worked late into the night on important speeches, the breakfast room where they had shared thousands of quiet morning conversations, the balcony where they had watched their children play in the gardens below. In each room, she could almost feel his presence, could almost hear his voice offering comfort or making her laugh. The palace felt both empty without him and completely filled with his memory. Margaret realized that while James was gone, the life they had built together would always exist in these spaces, in these memories, in the love that continued to surround their family. The funeral itself was both magnificent and heartbreaking. Westminster Cathedral was filled with world leaders, but Margaret's attention was focused entirely on her children. Michael stood with the dignity and strength that would define his own reign, but she could see the little boy in his eyes who just wanted his father back. Sarah delivered a reading with a steady voice that barely concealed her grief. David served as one of the pallbearers, his face set in determined composure that reminded Margaret so much of James. The moment that would be remembered forever came during Margaret's own tribute to her husband. Standing at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, she spoke not as a queen but as a woman who had loved deeply and lost everything. Her voice broke only once when she said, "James often told me that a life well lived is measured not by its length, but by the love it contains and the good it accomplishes. By that measure, his life was extraordinary." As the funeral procession made its way through the streets of the capital, Margaret was overwhelmed by the sight of millions of people lining the route. They stood in respectful silence as the hearse passed, many with tears streaming down their faces. Children waved small flags, elderly people saluted, and flowers were thrown gently onto the path. The love for James was palpable, a living thing that seemed to embrace the royal family even in their deepest grief. The private burial later that day was attended only by immediate family and closest friends. As James was laid to rest in the royal cemetery beside generations of his ancestors, Margaret felt both an ending and a beginning. The man she had loved was gone, but the family they had created together would carry on his legacy. The values he had taught their children, the love he had shown to his people, the example he had set of service and dedication, would all continue long after this final goodbye. Standing beside James's grave as the sun set over the palace grounds, Margaret made a silent promise. She would honor his memory by living fully, by supporting their children as they navigated their new responsibilities, and by finding ways to continue the charitable work that had meant so much to both of them. James's death was not the end of their love story, but a transformation of it, from a partnership in life to a commitment to preserving everything beautiful they had built together. As tears fell for the final time that day, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected to feel so soon after such a profound loss. She felt hope. Hope that healing would come, that joy would return, that the love that had sustained them through 35 years of marriage would continue to sustain her and their children through whatever challenges lay ahead. James would have wanted nothing less for the family he had cherished above all else, and Margaret was determined to honor that wish with every day of life that remained to her.